So me and Andy spent nearly the whole day down at the airport at Miami at Hangar 92, and we counted off literally everything that we had. We had thousands of items, all to do with scuba, and tanks, fins, masks, everything. It took us ages. Andy was meticulous with paperwork, and he was showing me where to put things, and the little security numbers on them had to be checked off. And back then it was triple done, so you had the blue lining paper underneath, and it would mark through on 3 or 4 different pages. So we had a white page, a pink page, a yellow page, and we also had a blue page, and they would be given out to Andy. Would keep obviously the top copy, and the client that Andy would sell stuff to would get a yellow copy. Andy would bring the paperwork back, and then he would give them to the various dive centers that he got the gear from, to show them, prove them that he'd given the stuff out. And Andy was never a thief. Andy was a canny businessman, but he was never a thief. He wouldn't steal from people. He was just cutting his own throat if he did so. So he was meticulous in his paperwork, and he always tripled it. He always had copies, you know what I mean? Andy would scribble on napkins and pieces of paper. He never ever had a notebook with him while he was working or flying or selling. And I just ended up buying a couple of notebooks and then just taking them, and then I started jotting things down. I would give him to give me the stuff he was writing on, and I would just write that down and keep a proper copy of it. And I know, and he appreciated that, and he enjoyed it. So we stopped every now and then for coffee and tea, and we popped out. We took Jeff with us to get some food, and we went to another Kenny Rogers Roasters, and we had some healthy food. I remember eating a ton of chicken and rice and salads and stuff like that, and drinking lots of cold water and just fresh orange juice. Jeff was an absolute animal. That guy, there wasn't a pick on him. He was like a Biafran. You could have slid him under the door for good luck. You could have picked the lock with him, and he was so skinny. If he stuck his tongue out and turned sideways, he would have looked like a zipper. The type of guy that had to run about in the rain to get wet. He was so thin, but he could eat, and he enjoyed his food, and he was actually very, very good crack. He was an ex-Air Force pilot, did 20 years in the Royal Air Force, and had also apparently flown with the Red Arrows, which he didn't really talk too much about. But I saw in his office in the hangar, all the pictures of Red Arrows and standing with a bunch of guys in uniforms and stuff. So he had a great history, and unless somebody offered me a glimpse into their life, I very rarely would ask personal questions. I was always under the assumption that if people wanted to know, that they would tell you. But I was also curious, and I would ask Jeff the odd question every now and then. And I found out that Jeff had been married and he'd had a couple of kids, and while he was away in the Air Force, his wife basically cleaned out the bank account, sold the house, sold everything, left him a note saying your dinner's in the dog. And the most ironic thing about it was, he didn't have a dog. Next door had a dog. And he never saw his kids again after that. She took the money and she ran. And Jeff basically had a few pound in a small account, and he borrowed some money off his friends. Once they found out what went on, they all basically had a whip round for him, and got a few grand together and gave it to him. Friends are friends at the end of the day. And men like that will very rarely shit on men. Men will, if they're friends, or they've stood in the same mud and the same blood and wore the same uniform, or were in the military together, those guys are friends forever, and they'll take care of each other, if and when needed. And Jeff's friends had come through for him. Jeff had been honest and says, look guys, there's nothing more for me in the UK. He was getting a pension, he was getting a small pension, which his wife didn't get. So he would get that monthly, and he moved over to the States, and he moved over with basically the clothes on his back and a small grab bag of stuff. and he was living in and out of cheap motels, and had looked through the local papers or something for aircraft mechanics, and had found a company down there. I think it used to work. He did something for Learjet, for a guy that had something to do with Learjets, and he was a mechanic on them and also a test pilot for when this guy was selling planes. He would take them up and test them, and he made a bunch of cash, and he was able to buy himself a really nice house, a nice car. He'd met somebody else. He'd met an American woman, and after a couple of years, of being in the country and stuff, he'd married her, and they'd ended up having 2 little girls. So he was well set. And then he was saying that the workload for the Learjet guy who was selling him just got too much for him, and his mechanics started to quit, and Jeff was the last one, and he obviously threw more and more work at him, and Jeff just says, "Fuck you, I'm not going to kill myself." So it was only a couple of hangers down from Andy, and he just got talking to Andy one day, and he just says, "Andy, do you know anybody who needs an aircraft mechanic?" And Andy says, "Yeah, I do." And Andy just says, "Look, I can't pay you very much, but he says, I'll pay you a good wage." He says, "But I can't pay you what those other guys." And Jeff was like, "That's fine." And so he'd been working for Andy for about 7 years, and they got on really well, both being pilots, both being Air Force pilots. There was a lot of history between them, and he was a really cool guy. And it was great to sit down with these 2 guys, because it was one of the rare times that I'd actually seen Andy have belly laughs. Him and Jeff would just talk away and slag each other about, the different, how shit their militaries were and all this type of stuff, and just really rib each other. And it was great just to see Andy just, break out and let go, and just really, really enjoy himself. And I sat there and was listening to these 2 guys, and, it was like fucking Abbott and Costello. It was brilliant. They just bounced off each other, and it was really good to see Andy laugh, and it was good to see Jeff have a bit of cracking, and I just says, Andy, once we'd left and took Jeff back, and after everything was done and dusted, I said, "Look, we really, should hang out with Jeff a bit more, and pull him in, and bring him to lunch and stuff." And Andy was like, "Yeah, you're right." And Andy goes, "You're a good influence on me, Cole." He says, "I wouldn't never really do this stuff." He says, "No, that's good to do." He says, "You're right, And I said, "Look, the guy works for you all day, fucking 7 days a week, you know what I mean? It's not such a big thing to take him to lunch and, and have a bit of fun with him." And Andy agreed that would be done more. So Andy signed off on the paperwork that Jeff had done on the plane, and made sure that everything was working, did his pre-flight checks, had walked around, tires, fuel, poundages of fuel, all the dials were working, GPS was working, aileron servo tabs, there was no damage to the props, that everything was just really good. And I walked around with Jeff when he was doing the pre-flight checks, and he was asking me how I was getting on with the flying and stuff, and I told him that it started really getting into the manual and stuff, and he asked me a couple of questions, and and I answered as best I could, and then he would give me a little bit more info. "If you can remember this," he goes, "this is also related to that," and it was really, really good. And he just says, "Look," he said, "I've got a small flight simulator at home." He says, he says, I'll give it to you." He says, "Hooks up to your TV, pedals, little yoke." He goes, and there were videotapes back then in the 90s, and he goes, "I've got videotapes." He says, "And he says, "and a video recorder, I'll give them to you." He says, "I don't use them anymore." He said, "I used to just have a bit of fun on them." He says, "But I'll give it to you." He says, "And it's great to practice on." He says, "So when you guys come back from Bermuda," he goes, I'll have it here for you. Gladly have it, Colin." I was fucking blown away. You know what I mean? I'd never seen a flight simulator before. And, it was just a little yoke that you put on the desk, and you kind of, screwed it onto the desk so it didn't move. You had your pedals and everything, and, it was a little screen. Screen was on the TV and stuff, so you had to maneuver it, because we didn't have laptops back then or anything like that. So you'd have to connect it to your TV. And because the TV was lower than, than you would sit on a chair, it was kind of on almost on the ground. It would mean that I would be literally sitting down, and so it would mean getting some type of a little table, and maybe a small stool or something. But that would be something that I would cross when when the time came. So I was really looking forward to getting the flight simulator.